Welcome to the Canada School of Public Service to our virtual cafe where we have virtual conversations with real coffee. So grab your coffee and sit in front of your computer for an hour or so to learn something that's important to you as one of Canada's public servants. Today is our first of two kind of Canada and the World weeks. There's a big event happening tomorrow to our neighbors in the south, and that will have profound impacts not only on Canada but on the world. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the state of the world, so to speak, and then Thursday, January 21st, from 1:30 to 2:30, we're having our second virtual cafe of the week, and that is to specifically discuss Canada-US relations with the incoming Biden administration. Today we have about 1,200 people online, so it's a really good audience for an important topic. We are joined today by two guests. Our first guest is Professor David Carment, who is a professor at Carleton University, and he is also a fellow at the Canadian Affairs Institute. And our second guest is Anne Fitzgerald, who is a professor at Wilfrid Laurier University and also the director of the Balsillie School of International Affairs. Welcome to you both. So I'm going to start with you, Anne. Anne, we have a big event happening tomorrow, as I mentioned. What will that mean for our world tomorrow?
Well, thank you very much, Taiki, and thank you for the kind invitation to join you today in this important coffee morning. What will tomorrow mean? Lots of things. First of all, America has necessarily to be inward looking for the time being, and it has a lot of reparation at home. What that means for its international focus is unclear. However, Biden was Obama's point man for many regions of the world, and although he doesn't have any real big legacies from that role, he has crystallized quite a few relationships around the world in different places, including a place like Ukraine, where the US has a huge investment at the moment. Where the UK has a huge investment, where things are not changing concerning the situation between Ukraine and Russia. So I think we'll see an inward focus, but we're also going to see selective continuity in different parts of the world. How enthusiastic Joe Biden will be towards propping up the wide range of multilateral institutions, regional and sub-regional institutions that the US has supported over the years will be uncertain. I think that it's also true that the United States has been at war in different places since 2001. And I think some strategic decisions will be taken towards military drawback in some places and military bolstering and reinforcement in other places. And we saw the start of that happening over the last couple of years. My sense is that it's not going to be reversed. So just a few points to put on the table to start with.
Thank you, Anne. David, what does tomorrow's big event mean from your perspective for the world?
Well, if you had asked me that question 2 months ago, Taki, I would have said the answer to the world's problems are diplomacy, diplomacy, diplomacy. And in fact, in an event like this, just before the outcome was decided in the November election, I followed Joe Biden's recommendations on how to re-engage the world, and diplomacy was at the top of his list. But what we've seen in the last couple of weeks is a flurry of activities on the part of the Trump administration to essentially undermine the potential for the United States to re-engage the world. It's doing so in a number of controversial ways, punishing Iran, punishing China, putting further sanctions on Russia and so on, and making life difficult, if not miserable, for American allies. So while I was optimistic just a scant 2 months ago, I'm less optimistic now that Joe Biden is going to be the kind of guy who can really bring the United States back, as he said during the election, much echoing, I guess, our own prime minister, that Canada was back in the 2015 election, I'm more likely to believe that what we're doing is entering an era of competitive multilateralism. That entails a loosening up of alliances coupled with alternative political and economic orders and very weak institutions to manage the current geopolitical rivalry between China and the United States, as well as the United States and Russia. Essentially, what we've witnessed over the last 20 years is a shifting from a unipolar system to a multipolar system. Obviously, the rise of China has a lot to do with that. It's the only country, the major power that is going to see economic growth over this year, 2.5%, I believe. Its GDP is expected to exceed that of the United States by the end of this decade in 2028. That forecast has been pushed ahead, in large part because of China's economic capacity to basically rebound from the pandemic, but also because it signed into force, working with 14 other countries, a fairly comprehensive economic partnership, they call it, including countries that are ostensibly allies of the United States and Canada, Japan, and Australia, and New Zealand amongst them. So China's rise is really posing as I don't need to tell your audience this, is posing a challenge to the United States, but it's having some significant impacts on America's allies. Increasingly, what we've witnessed is increasing unilateral action on the part of the United States, executive orders coming fast and furious, national emergencies being invoked to pressure and sanction adversaries of the United States, including energy infrastructure as well as arms sales conducted by American adversaries. The goal ultimately is to not only punish adversaries, but now increasingly it's become apparent to use or weaponize extraterritoriality, that is unilateral action, to bring American allies into line. So not only are the adversaries of the United States being punished, but I think so too are its allies. This is ultimately means targeting the capabilities, resources, the capacities of American allies to make sure that they don't, if you will, defect to the adversarial side. In part, this is a function of American concern about China's economic growth, but it's also driven by a very deep concern the United States has over Europe's future, in part concern about deeper integration between Russia and Western Europe. With the pipeline being built across Northern Europe to bring gas into Western Europe, the Americans have seen fit to punish and sanction the builders of those pipelines. And in doing so, a number of companies within Western Europe, up to 200, are facing sanctions imposed by the United States, if you can believe it, as well as 12 countries being affected by those sanctions. Now, the European Union has declared those sanctions to be illegal. So you can imagine the kind of controversy we're facing in the near future. This isn't about simply taking on China, Russia. It's now making sure that those alliances that the Americans tried to build, and which Canada benefits greatly, are not going to be eroded sufficiently that countries no longer see their interests being satisfied through them. Coupled with that is the pursuit of what I would call gray zone conflict and hybrid warfare. Now, we can talk at great length about that, but the upshot is that democratic oversight of the kinds of conflictual strategies the United States and its allies are now pursuing is weak or absent, and this leads to some problems for accountability and transparency. To give you an example, the Americans have more special forces abroad than they do diplomats. That's why I preface my comments by suggesting that diplomacy is in large part a solution to the problem. This didn't happen overnight. It's not necessarily something that Donald Trump initiated. It's been in place since 9/11 and the American decision to intervene unilaterally in Iraq. I mean, obviously, for those of us who work in Ottawa, we know the United States has not put an ambassador in Canada for the better part of 2 years. Obviously, they didn't see it necessary to do that. So kind of an interesting problem here in that we're seeing the democratic liberal states becoming more authoritarian, if we will, if not autocratic, in the way in which they engage in conflict. And I think this poses problems for Canada, which has benefited greatly from the institutions that emerged after World War II.
Yeah. So, David, I'm going to jump in here. So we've got a lot of interesting themes on the table. I think I'm going to take them in kind of 3 blocks. So the first block I'm going to ask each of you about, and I'll go back to Anne, I think I'll kind of ask you to make a little bit of analogy. Let's kind of imagine the world as a neighborhood. And if the world is a neighborhood, and tell us what's going on in that neighborhood. Is that neighborhood getting safer? Is it getting more dangerous? Is it quieter? Is it louder? Is it somewhere you really want to live, or do you kind of want to move? What's going on with our kind of our planetary neighborhood? And then in the next block, I want to talk a little bit about the rules of our global neighborhood, which will lead us into a discussion on institutions. So let's try and talk a little bit about the neighborhood and then maybe a little bit about the rules of the neighborhood. So Anne, what's going on in the global neighborhood?
Well, I think uncertainty, although however cliche it sounds, is the theme of the day. And I'll start with the pan domain of space, information, and cyber. So this is a very unknown territory for us. And I think we're trying to, the front allies, and particularly the Five Eyes, are trying to stay up with the latest research coming out on that. We've seen an integration of the science domains and the social science and humanities domains, but there's no overarching authority that's giving strategic direction on this. So I think we do need to work towards some sort of multilateral institution or international authority on this domain, because it's worrying, really concerning. And you know, the fact that artificial intelligence, there's a lot of work going on here in Waterloo on this issue. The fact that our artificial intelligence can not only spread content, but can develop content is frightening, especially as we all depend not only on the internet at the moment, particularly during these lockdowns, but we depend on social media channels for information. So that leads to the second thing, which is of equal concern, is the disinformation and misinformation this is leading to. And I'm seeing this in a number of conflicts I'm following at the moment, polarizing people, dividing people, and we should not underestimate the extent to which that can impact us here on Canadian soil. We've seen how it's played out in the United States. I'm watching it in a number of African countries at the moment, in the Middle East, in Yemen, in Southeast Asia even, in fairly peaceful, stable environments. So I think this whole pan domain is an area of real concern. I think the other area is Europe and how the post-Brexit stage in Europe will play out. I mean, Britain will get through, Britain's got through very tough times in the past in different points of history, and it will get through this time as well. In fact, it's expediting so many recovery plans at the moment around the vaccine, around harsh economic measures to bounce back. It'll be a long time coming, though, for Britain to get back to where it was pre-2012. So, you know, this creates concerns for Europe. Post-Brexit plans are still in a state of disarray. The uncertainty over Armin Laschet's positions in Germany, having been the front runner post-Merkel. But I think that we will still see Germany as a stabilizer. We'll see the European Union become a very loose structure of opt-in and opt-out policies and positions that will wither away in time. I think the European Union had an opportunity in taking that GDPR effort to be the lead governor of the digital Silk Road to greater heights before the pandemic and before the EU started unraveling with Brexit. So we're seeing different organizations in a real state of disarray. The United Nations can barely pay its bills at the moment. In many buildings in New York, elevators have not been used because of the costs that these are incurring. That poses questions to the future of a structure like the United Nations. Whether
I want to hold off for a moment.
Okay.
institutions, because that'll be the next thing. David, tell us how you see this this neighborhood called Planet Earth right now.
Well, okay. I mean, it's an interesting question. It's a nice analogy. Is it a Gangs of New York neighborhood, Lower East Side, where you've got the local enforcer who is trying to expand his turf, and it's not clear who that local enforcer is. Is it the United States or China or Russia? Do we have emerging spheres of influence in which the various mobs basically agree with one another that they will not step on each other's territory? I think we're seeing a bit of both. The problem in our neighborhood, our immediate neighborhood, is that we, for the lack of a better term, we've been dealing with, we've been dealing with what we might call the neighborhood bully. So we know personally that this has impacted Canadian livelihoods with the closure of the border with respect to the United States' failure to properly deal with the pandemic, but also the hint that they may send or deploy troops along the Canadian-American border out of concern that Canada constituted a threat to the United States, of all things. But more importantly, I mean, if you want to look at that relationship, the Trump administration designed and implemented a kind of strategy that essentially was converting what we would call shared institutions, the most important of those being NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and also, of course, our free trade agreement that we have with the United States and Mexico, turning that from a shared institution to one in which they could leverage their influence over the weaker countries. So despite alternative explanations to the outcome, I think we fared badly with respect to the USMCA agreement, in large part because there's a number of clauses there that impose American suzerainty over Canadian sovereignty with respect to entering into, for example, a free trade agreement with a non-market economy, namely China. So essentially, America has been dictating policy to the United States and has done so similarly to the United Kingdom, and is now doing so with respect to the European Union and other countries who they feel are falling out of line. This can only be understood in the context of America's intense rivalry with that other neighborhood bully, if you will, China. And so Joe Biden has said, well, basically, you know, we're going to cooperate, but also compete with China as opposed to conflict with China. What exactly that means, I can't tell you, and I suspect you're going to get ahead. I'm getting ahead of myself here. So the problem is, as Anne has pointed out, the institutions that we've typically held in abeyance that have restrained American adventurism and unilateralism are simply not functioning anymore. That's partly a result of our own failure to reinvigorate them. You told us not to get political, but I think we've seen a lot of rhetoric coming from a government that was committed to strengthening those institutions, but has not really put a sufficient effort into that, including securing a seat on the Security Council. So partly out of negligence, partly out of the strength of the Americans to shape global order according to its whim. I mean, after all, this is a country that believes that it is beyond the purview of international oversight, threatening to sanction the International Criminal Court should it conduct an investigation of American criminal activity in Afghanistan.
Yeah. So now, our neighborhood now, our global neighborhood, we're seeing things like pandemics. We're seeing things like a global recession. And as David noted, China is the only major economy that's actually growing. We're seeing climate change. We're seeing misinformation. We're seeing all these kind of nebulous, difficult things. Historically, the way we respond to that is through our institutions, through our global institutions, through things like the United Nations, the World Bank, the IMF, NATO, WTO. All of those institutions played a major important role in our post-World War II existence. And talk to us a little bit about those institutions. Are they able to kind of help Canada survive in this kind of difficult neighborhood going forward? Historically, Canada's foreign policy, I think it's fair to say, has been to work through those institutions and to help build those institutions into global entities that can help mediate some of these issues. Are those institutions now sufficient? Are they strong enough to kind of go forward in kind of 2021 and on? Anne?
Well, I think a lot of them aren't fit for purpose, or elements of a lot of them aren't fit for purpose. So when we talk about the UN, sometimes I think we have to draw a distinction between those policy corridors and the agencies that are out there doing the work on the ground, which in part are constrained by some of the policy corridors. I think the tools in the toolbox need to change, and I think ones that have been put on shelves in the basement need to be brought back out. And David mentioned diplomacy earlier on. I've come back from having been out of Canada for 25 years recently, and one thing that I did do a lot of around the world was facilitate dialogue and discussion, and I observed other mediation processes. And I think, you know, they're the sort of things that you don't read a lot about. They're the sort of things that have been backed by a number of these organizations, but they're also the things that have gained most traction, in my view. And the other thing that I think has gained most traction is the work of direct national support to problematic areas and regions in the form of both hard power and soft power. And often, I would say, if we're looking at a balance, the scales are in favor of, certainly over the last 10 years, a lot of direct national interventions. And even the coalitions of the willing, you've got some prominent players anyway. So I think we're in the era of, well, the functionality is going to be around minilateralism, like-mindedness, coalitions, soft power as well. We need to evaluate what our national instruments are of power and think, you know, how we're going to use them to achieve objectives going forward. So education in Canada, for instance, it's something that the multilateral institutions don't really deal with, but I think it's going to be terribly important going forward, and the projection of it will be important. I think diplomacy, talking around the table, Canada has an enormous role to play in diplomacy, and I mean, this is why somebody like me has been invited on several occasions to the table. I don't bring a colonial cloak like a lot of British interventions will, and others. We represent some really strong values and rules here in Canada. And we have a lot of things that work and that we've had to work on over the years to make work, that others are looking for: immigration policies, federalist structures, etc. So asymmetric regional federalist arrangements. And to promote those vis-a-vis diplomatic channels, I think, will be important, and to find that capacity within the international structures to support will be important. These processes over the last 10 years work according to begging bowls coming out every time a set of talks is required. So I think the other issue will be looking at sub-regional organizations, most of which are dormant, most of which don't operate very well, learning lessons from ASEAN, some of ASEAN's really forward-thinking functions, one of which has to do with science and one of which has to do with education, and really countries like Malaysia and Indonesia and others, Taiwan, have really benefited from those tools. So it's not so much abandoning some of the running organizations, but advocating for change in the toolbox and reasserting the role of diplomacy and the enablers that are required to promote diplomacy.
Thanks, Anne. David, tell us a little bit about how you see our institutions and how they're able to kind of help mediate the global environment for Canada right now.
Well, I'm going to try and disabuse you, Taki, if I can, if I may, of the idea that they are our institutions. We're now witnessing the rise of competing institutions. And essentially, this is how I began my discussion by suggesting that there's a form of competitive multilateralism in play. We don't understand it that way. We don't recognize it. Canadians aren't probably well informed of that. But there are alternative institutional orders that great powers are putting in place that could rival the existing institutional framework, which is largely a result of the American desire to reshape the post-World War II era. So goes the United States. That is the direction in which these institutions, the conventional ones that Canada clings to, will go as well. If the United States doesn't see benefit in the strengthening of these institutions, then certainly they will not be sustained. They are very much a function of the ability of the United States to shape the world order. But now we're seeing alternative institutions being proposed. These include, for example, a number of infrastructure banks that Canada has signed on to. And as I mentioned earlier, China has its own political and economic relationship with the countries in the Asia Pacific, and has just signed into force a fairly comprehensive, the world's largest trade grouping, which excludes Canada. So it's time that we began to realize that there are other countries putting into place institutions, and the question isn't whether or not that is happening. It's not a debatable proposition, but rather whether countries like Canada, who currently are residing with an institutional architecture that is the creation of the United States, wish to switch or change or find value in being part of these new institutional frameworks. And
David, just kind of maybe summarize for the benefit of our audience. I think what I'm hearing you say to our audience, and parts of our audience work at Global Affairs, and part of our audience works at Immigration and Refugee Canada, and kind of the international domain. I think what I'm hearing you say is institutions like the UN, the World Bank, the IMF, NATO, WTO, that played such a critical role after the post-World War II era, those institutions now have rivals, and that those institutions will not play as big a role going forward as they did in the past. Is that a fair summary?
That is my argument. The question of whether people agree with this observation or not is open to debate. But the point being that there are now rival institutions being put in place. Yes, they're small, they're nascent, they are emergent, but they are very much a function of the need for these emerging powers, these great powers such as China and Russia and its coalitions, to bring members of the existing institutional frameworks into their sphere of influence.
Thanks, David. Can I throw that main point back to you for your reaction? So I think I heard you say slightly the opposite. I think I heard you say something to the effect of, we need to reinvigorate these institutions going forward so that they can do the work they're supposed to do. Give us a little bit of your reaction to David's notion that these institutions, it sounds like what David is saying is that these institutions aren't kind of the play that Canada should do going forward, and we should start looking at some other kind of, let's call them alternative international institutions going forward.
Well, it's a bit of each camp that I'm going to focus on. The first thing is a hard review, but we cannot apply a hard review or initiate a hard review unless we've got some good direction, some objectives. And I think this is the first thing that needs to be grounded here for Canada. What outcomes do we want to see in the world? What is it that we want to do in the world? And when I say objectives, I don't want the audience to feel that I'm advocating for a very complicated strategic review or a complicated foreign policy review. This doesn't need to be complicated. We have brilliant analysts sitting in all security-related agencies and agencies with an international file in Canada, just to sort of crystallize and synthesize that, make it as current as possible and project. We've got horizon scanning units. What does this mean for the outcomes that we want to see? So once we have some beacons out there that are manageable, maybe sort of no more than 3 to 5 in number, because then it makes our direction achievable, then we can review what is the case at the moment in the world of multilateralism, because some of those things we will wish to preserve. We will wish to preserve a strong presence, and in fact, we would want to strengthen our presence in the Arctic Council. That brings us together with both like-minded partners and some difficult partners. These are the kind of partners that we need to engage with. And we will have strengths in the UN system that we will need to deepen because of the way they support those beacons, that strategic objective. We, a diplomatic presence in Canada, a diplomatic infrastructure for the projection of direct national support and the application of national instruments may be required in that toolbox as well. And just being present for conversations, having that strategic narrative that we can share. Strategic narratives are memorable narratives. And when you get down into the details of operational programs, however laudable they are, like the ELSI initiative, FIAP, etc., what we're trying to do at the programmatic level, it sometimes gets lost on international players. We need some good strategic messages that are fit and aligned with certain organizations around the world and the diplomatic presence to back it up.
Thanks. I want to shift focus a little bit now and take kind of advantage of your respective expertise. You're both students of international affairs. You're both scholars of international affairs, which means you kind of look at how different countries kind of plug and play into the world. I'd like to kind of ask you now, who are the kind of in your opinions, or your respective opinions, who are the savvy international players in the global arenas that Canada can benefit from in terms of watching them and saying, wow, if we act like Singapore in this domain, that's going to be really good for Canada. Or if we act like Israel in that domain, or like Denmark in that domain, who in your minds are the kind of the countries that kind of maybe punch proportionately above their weight, so to speak, right now in the global world arena, that we as policy people in the government of Canada can start looking towards a little bit and studying a little bit to kind of learn maybe some better tools or how to sharpen our tools. David, I'll start with you. Who do you admire in this realm?
Well, I've been a long admirer of Angela Merkel and her leadership, taking Germany through a very difficult journey, in large part for reasons outside of her doing. Ostensibly, the issue of Ukraine's implosion and Russia's subsequent intervention in parts of Ukraine. She's handled that masterfully in the sense of mediating between two very difficult camps. She's established herself as a preeminent leader of Europe, and I think more recently we're seeing face down Donald Trump, and her administration as well has also faced down Donald Trump with respect to these sanctions that they mentioned earlier. It's a shame that she's leaving because I can't imagine anyone replacing her. So I would put Germany at the top of my list. The difficulty to emulate these kinds of countries is that I wouldn't say Canada is alone, but it doesn't enjoy the kind of institutional framework that the EU brings to its members. Notwithstanding the departure of the United Kingdom, which I think would be on my other end of this scale if we were to pick one country, one cannot come to grips with how this country has behaved or why it chose to behave this way. Boris Johnson, I think, has been abysmal as a leader, and I know we're not supposed to be political, but I can only imagine. I suppose the economy will increase, but it's taken itself outside that security architecture. But any member of the European Union has come off rather well with respect to the pandemic. To a large extent, I mean, there are some exceptions that have been dragged along despite their weaknesses, Italy and France in particular. And I know it's tempting to identify the Nordic states as well, but they benefit from somewhat more isolated presence in the world and keep to themselves. But I would pick Germany. After all, this is a country that has hosted close to what, 400,000 refugees, and has done so with significant success. I guess they're not refugees, they're asylum seekers. Nevertheless, everyone predicted that Germany would succumb to the pressure brought to bear by these refugees, and it has not. So it's shown remarkable leadership in the world. I think that unfortunately Americans are doing everything within their power to keep Germany down, which is often a problem for them. The one thing that the Americans fear is a working relationship between Russia and Germany and Western Europe. Yeah. So I would put them at the top of the list. There are other countries we could pick, but I think Germany surpasses any of the others that I could possibly identify. I like
that a lot, David, because Germany, in addition to kind of the self-interest role that everybody has to play in the global context, also plays, as David very nicely mentioned, a mediating role, a role where they're trying to bring together the different interests and the different pressures and the different realities of the global stage and try to mediate those interests. Because if we don't have mediators, whether those mediators are people or countries or institutions, conflict exacerbates, conflict gets more intense rather than diminishing. And Germany has very deftly played that role over at least the last decade. And turning to you, who can Canadian students of policy and international affairs, who should we study a little bit in terms of countries? Who should we try to, if not necessarily emulate, who can we study to learn from to say, this is the way that Canada would do a little bit better than it's doing today?
Well, I think David summarized certainly my top three that I would have talked about, but I would add to Angela Merkel's profile in her leadership in Germany that she has taught groups within Germany and other countries in the European Union that sometimes it's important to fall on our swords for the collective benefit. And I think she's done an absolutely unrivaled job in doing that. And it's really had an impact on the way other European countries have managed certain policies towards, different parts of their countries. The Netherlands, I think, has always impressed me as well. It's one to keep our eyes on. What they've done with their educational system and their, professional training culture has been very, very impressive. And they are at the forefront of diplomacy as well, along with Norway. I think one of the dark horses in this race is Indonesia. Indonesia is very, very interesting as a country in terms of how they've always got through very tough, difficult times through the way in which they manage their small to medium-sized enterprises. So any economically depressed period or recessed period, they've used the power of their SMEs to bring about recovery, and others, I think, have tried to emulate that. I think one thing that we have to remember moving forward is that we've got two competing economic models that have both been fruitful in some ways. One that has been less revolutionary in nature and akin to the liberal peace paradigm and order, and one that's been akin to more authoritarianism and communism, the developmental state model and the democratic state model. And I think there's countries out there that want to reform and want to improve that are trying to borrow bits and pieces from each of those models. And that's where we're seeing a number of conflicts. And I think we need, as policymakers, to recognize the true distinctions in those models. One works when you operate in a fairly homogeneous environment, when you've got a good national strategy and leadership and external financing and internal financing. But countries that are diverse and sometimes divisive in some regions try to import this model from the Asian experience and elsewhere, and it doesn't work because it requires a strong central government, strong security presence, and that doesn't lead to democracy that is important in very diverse societies.
Thank you. So I want to switch now. We've been spending most of our time kind of taking Canada and looking out. I want to do the inverse, and I want to kind of take the world and look to Canada and kind of tell our audience a little bit how you see that most countries around the world see Canada. If you're sitting in a capital in Europe or a capital in Asia or a capital in Latin America, how do you see Canada? And does that kind of give us any advantages that we can build on? Does that give us something that we can work towards to kind of promote our own interests? I'll start with you, David. How does a typical kind of world leader or a typical kind of world capital look at Canada in the contemporary era?
Well, unfortunately, I'm the kind of bad news guy here, so I hope Anne can counterbalance my criticisms with something positive. But I will say that a good indicator of how Canada is perceived is how we have failed to secure a seat on the Security Council. I know there's more to it than that. But Greta Thunberg, of all people, was part of a letter campaign that suggested that Canada should not obtain a seat on the Security Council. There was a coalition of a variety of different players, including those focused on the Middle East, in particular, Palestinian-Israeli issues. Nevertheless,
David,
yeah.
that's not kind of like how the world sees Canada, right? Like that's like,
well, it's a good chunk
if you
of
were
the
to
world.
say to a typical president in a country, like, how do you see Canada? What's Canada about? I don't think the Security Council seat would be the thing that would jump up at the top of their list.
I would look at the media and the way in which Canada, I don't think you can understate the importance of how we are perceived as having shifted from the kind of middle power mediating peacekeeping nation that we often see ourselves as being, to being a country deeply ensconced in the American firmament, if you will, deeply ensconced in the American geopolitical sphere of influence. And I know the average person in the world doesn't look at it in those terms, but I don't think they look at us as a consequential player in international relations, unfortunately. If we're caught up in a rivalry between China and the United States, it's only because we are an externality to the problem that those two countries face. It's not because they see us as a threat to their interests, but rather because we are a means to an end. And that means ostensibly politicizing extraterritoriality through the extradition of Meng Wanzhou. It means ultimately punishing us for the actions of our key ally, the United States. Our relationship, to a larger extent than ever before, with the world can only be understood through our relationship with the United States. And I think we've come so far from being a country that is being seen as independent. Can't get a free trade deal done with India, nor China. We're on the outside looking in with a free trade deal involving 15 very large economies in the Asia Pacific.
And so David's
I would suggest that the Security Council seat, the failure to secure that, yeah.
So Anne, David's playing Cassandra. Are you going to play Pollyanna, or are you going to continue Cassandra vis-a-vis how the rest of the world kind of sees Canada?
Well, I'm certainly not going to play Pollyanna, but I will give you a frank and honest opinion of, like I said earlier, someone who's just come back after 25 years and someone who's extraordinarily proud to be Canadian and her roots. Okay, so I think I'm going to start with the word confused. I think we confuse people. People have often talked to me about the wonderful quality of life we have in Canada. We are perceived to be good people, and we're liked. We are actually, I'm not gonna use that word just yet, but I think people embrace our values and look on us in a very enviable way for upholding values. People often talk to me about seeing shots on social media on July 1st when people are gathered in Ottawa with paint on their face, celebrating of all different backgrounds. And people have often said that that's wonderful. Confused because people also say, why aren't they here at the table? And, you know, we wish we had their voice beside us in these sorts of discussions. We know that's what Canada represents, but where are they? So I think there's a feeling, quite honestly, that we're disengaged and that the great things that we talk about are not materializing into meaningful activity on the ground. I think we risk being caught out as well in a few places. We talk a lot about peacekeeping. We've hardly got any peacekeepers out there in the world at the moment. It's an area, though, full of opportunity that we could lead a new debate on. Especially with pandemic preparedness and all sorts of other threats that we have to confront. Another issue is that, well, the US-Canada relationship, as David says, is terribly important. And one thing that we've had strong in that relationship over the years is the defense relationship. The relationship between our two militaries is very strong, but there have been concerns over the last 10 years about interoperability and equipment and the ability for us to patrol our sovereignty, whether it's in polar areas, whether it's in the seas, or whether it's here on land or in air. And there's been concerns about the type of aircraft, government aircraft coming into US airspace. So if that is just left to fester without being addressed, it will hurt what have been good, strong relationships in the past. So I think that to put some, so for the processes I've been involved in with the UN, with the AU, with the British government supporting, it's great having a Canadian at the table, as other Canadians have in representing us, but sometimes we're not funded by Canada, or we're not supported by Canada in those roles. Canada's got great people, really educated and forward-thinking types who bring great diplomacy skills, who bring fantastic knowledge mobilization and policy sharing to others. And I think we need to use that more through diplomacy. Diplomacy is a safe area to step into, even with difficult situations. So I think we need to eradicate the confusion. We need to increase the dynamism. We need to also dumb down the absolutism. We tend to take positions that are on either one end of the spectrum. And I think, you know, this is, yes, Britain's got a lot of problems at the moment, but Britain has navigated in that gray area quite well, especially with realistic pragmatism towards tough partners. And I think we've just got to show that we're brave enough to play in that space.
Well, it's a big, scary world out there, and we're a relatively little country of 37, 38 million souls. And we have to find our way. And I want to thank Professor David Carmet and Professor Anne Fitzgerald for helping us think a little bit about how Canada finds its way in this new global order. The global order is constantly changing. It feels to a lot of us that these changes are particularly profound at this moment in time. For myself, it feels like this is kind of our post-World War II moment. This is kind of the moment where the globe kind of decides, are we going to go left? Are we going to go right? Are we going to go forward? Are we going to go backward? And it's been wonderful to spend this time with you to just kind of scratch a little bit the surface of these details. So Anne, David, thank you for your time. Thank you for your expertise. And most importantly, thank you for being friends of Canada's public service. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
All the best. Bye.